Alright, as I mentioned in the photo color manipulation assignment for this week, I'm going to create a few videos here to show you some different color manipulation techniques within Photoshop and Illustrator. So I'm going to show you how to do this with Photoshop first. In Photoshop, the big way that we can manipulate color on an image like this one is using a hue saturation adjustment layer. And you can click on this right here. If this window doesn't show up in your Photoshop by default, this is your adjustments window. You can open it by going to Window, Adjustments, right there. So if I turn it off, you can see now it's gone, and I can turn it back on just like that, right? So if I add a hue saturation adjustment layer, you'll see that down in my layers window here, we have our image on the background, and then our hue saturation adjustment was just added as a brand new layer to this image. And we get this properties window that opens up with that layer. This is where we can make all sorts of different hue and saturation adjustments. So saturation is the amount of the color. So if I slide this saturation slider, you can see all of these yellow tones get really bright yellow, they get really deep and rich. And the skin tones also get really vibrant, almost to the point, they do get to the point where it's just outrageously overdone. So you need to be kind of careful when you're using these different sliders, like the saturation one. If I want to reset this, I'm just going to switch it back to 0 by manually typing it in right there. And now this is back to where it was originally. But right above the saturation, we also have our hue slider. And this changes the color of either the image as a whole or specific tones. If I want, I can select to just change the yellows, for instance. If I wanted to change the background on this image, I could select yellows. And then when I change this hue slider, you can see that it's just changing the yellow portions of the image. There is a little bit right here by your hair where you can see that it's kind of messing with the color there, and then we're getting a little bit of the yellow tint on her hair as well. That's not quite as big of a deal because the yellow that was originally there was just a reflection from the wall. But this is how we can change something like that pretty easily, and it works really slick. If we want to cancel out this area by your hair so that that adjustment doesn't get made to that particular area, we can do that really easily with the mask on this hue saturation adjustment layer. So with the 4-corner frame around the mask preview, that means that we are painting on the mask rather than on the layer itself. And I'm going to use a black paintbrush. Right? You can see I have the brush tool selected, and black is my foreground color. And if I just paint over that area with my black paintbrush, you can see that it's blocking out the adjustment from those areas. So I'm going to make my brush a little larger here, and I'm just going to go over her whole face area because it just got a little bit of a purple tint when I changed the tone there. There's just enough yellow in her face that it was affected by it, and also down into her neck as well. Right? And you can see I fixed that up, and that looks a lot nicer. And if I wanted to, I could also go in and clean up some of this on her hair as well. Some of that yellow adjustment went onto there. And I may want to use a softer brush. This is kind of harsh, especially when we get towards the wall here, because if I start to paint over those strands of hair, then all of that yellow in the wall comes right back. So I'm going to use my history window and just jump back to before I had uncolored her hair. And I'm going to make my brush softer. We can do that either up here by moving this hardness slider, or the shortcut that I like to use is to hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and press the left bracket. And if I pull this up so you can see what that does, oh, it's not going to show it while I have it open, but it increments it by 25%. So if I go out of it and do Shift right bracket one time, this is now at 25%. If I do it once more, it's now at 50%. Once more, It's now at 75%, and the last time to get to 100. So I'm going to turn that the hardness of the brush down to 25%, and then I'm just going to brush in this area of her hair so that we can kind of get rid of some of that purple. And you can see that it doesn't have as harsh of a line where I'm removing that now as it did when my brush was at 100%. That it's kind of just easing it out rather than the sharp drop off that it had been. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We've got one color manipulation here. I don't think that there's any huge emotional impact to the photo as a result of it, but this shows you kind of how you can manipulate those things. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off this hue saturation adjustment layer. That way we can keep it, and you can turn it off and on just by checking the box right there. That's nice and easy. And I'm going to add one more hue saturation adjustment layer, and we're going to do something a little bit different with this one. With this image, I'm going to take the saturation slider and turn it all the way down to the very left, and now we have this grayscale image, right? And using that same masking technique that we used in the last one, I'm just going to add the color back to the snow cone. This is something, it's a technique that you may have seen in a lot of senior pictures. I know in the past it's been a really popular technique in senior pictures to have someone like holding a rose or a basketball and let the color from that stand out with the rest of the image being black and white. And we can do that really easily like this. Alright. So that's how we can modify colors this way. This particular image, again, I don't know this girl, so it doesn't have any sort of emotional impact, but you can see how you can draw attention to specific things if you make most of the image grayscale and leave one thing in color. You're drawing attention to that one specific item. Now that we're done editing this image, let's go ahead and save this one. I'm just going to do File, Save As. And what I ultimately want here, you should always save it as the Photoshop file as well. This is a completely editable file, and all of your layers and all of the adjustments are maintained within that Photoshop file. But for importing it into InDesign, I'm just going to turn this into a JPEG, and we'll call this one black and white. Because it's our mostly black and white image, and for right now, I'm going to save it to the desktop. It's always a good idea to make sure you keep track of where you're saving these things. And for this example, I'm going to save it to the desktop. I'd suggest that you put stuff into other folders if you have a folder for the class. You know, keep your files managed. It makes things work so much easier, especially when you start linking things into projects. But I'll save this to the desktop, say OK, and then I'm going to just toggle which layer I have selected here so that I have the background changed in my image. And I'm going to say File, Save As again, and save it once again as a JPEG, and this time we'll say pink background, and save that. And now we have 2 of our 3 color manipulations that we can work with. I hope that you put a little bit more thought into what kind of emotional response they might have, or why you are making the color manipulation that you're making. I just wanted to show you some of the technical tools here so that you have the resources available to make those manipulations more strategically than you might have otherwise. And now let's go ahead and take a look at Adobe Illustrator. I have one more technique to show you there, and then we'll talk about how to pull those images into InDesign. We'll open this image up with Illustrator, and let me zoom out here. Okay, Before we get started, I'm going to scale this image down just to make it fit within my frame here. I'll do that with that same Command Shift Option Command, or maybe just Shift Option. Yeah, Shift Option rather than Shift Option Command. And this makes it so that it maintains the aspect ratio and so that the adjustment is done from the center. And I'll just put it inside my frame there and zoom back in so that we're working entirely on the canvas. So in Illustrator, we can actually use the same image trace technique that we used to convert a bitmap piece of artwork to vector artwork in the other video that I made for you. In that one we use this 3-color adjustment, and I can show you what this looks like if I use the 3-color adjustment. It's telling me that the image is large, it may be slow. Alright, we'll say OK. It's going to take just a minute to analyze this image. And with a 3-color image trace, we're going to end up with a very crude facsimile of this image. It'll look really rough with large clusters of color. The whole background will probably be like one color just by itself, and it'll look odd. So just a heads up on that. Here you go. You can see what that looks like. We get a lot of simplification in the design here. And we could actually go in, we could expand this and go in and change the colors of individual shapes, because if I zoom in on this, you can see that we now have individual shapes here wherever there's something that's needing to be more clearly defined. But let's say I don't necessarily like how simple this has gotten. This is a little bit crude, especially in the eyes. So let's go ahead and try changing it to 6-color so you can see what that looks like. It'll take one moment again and analyze the photo, and then we'll get our new 6-color version of this image. And it'll probably have a bit more of the clarity back. We may get some blues from the shirt because the shirt was blue in the bitmap image, and that was completely lost when we converted it using the 3-color option. There you go. Now that that's done, you can see a little bit more definition in this image. You can see some clear lines for the eyes. You can see the blue of the t-shirt came back, and the blue on the snow cone is back. If we bump it up even more to 16 colors, we'll start getting even more and more definition to this image. And if 16 still isn't enough colors, if you want to jump it up even further and get lots of shapes to work with, lots of shapes to play around with, you can go into this image trace panel that I showed you before, and I'll show you this again in a moment, and we could adjust it to be even more colors still. That's almost done, and then I'll show you how we can adjust it. Right, so now you can even see some of the textures starting to return there. If I open the image trace panel, I can move this slider up, and let's put it at a 24 for right now, right? This is just the number of colors that it's using in this image. And we'll see more shading being introduced as we increase the number of colors, and also more shapes, because each of these little shading items is a new shape for it. Alright. Almost done. There we go. So now you can see even more of that. Now, what we can do with this image at this point is to expand it out. If we click this expand button right here, then we have all of our individual objects rather than one large object. And if I zoom in, and let's just click one of these so that we can get rid of all of our extra dots. Oh, we might have to click off. There we go. Now if I zoom in, I can select each of these individual shapes. When I double click on it, I can click on this, and then if I hold down the Shift key, I can click on multiple shapes here. So I'm just going to select all of this shade on the shirt, all the shapes that I can there. Might even have to zoom in a little more. They get pretty small. But what I can do is manually change the color of each of these. So if I wanted to change her shirt to purple, I could change each of these shapes by just going into our color palette here and I need to add a new swatch. And I can move the sliders. I'm just going to grab this purple slider, or the green slider actually. This is red, green, blue. And we have our different amounts of red and blue. And if I turn the green all the way off, then we end up with a pure purple, right? This is kind of going back to elementary school art class with the way those colors are combined. But I want this to be a moderately dark purple. Alright, so we'll go to right about there and say OK. And then we select that color, and you can see it applied to the shirt. Then I could go through to the next shade of blue and select all of those objects. And you can see how we're just kind of adding more and more of this purple tone to the image, right? And you can get as specific or vague as you would like with this. There's a lot of detail control in this process. But I could add another swatch with a lighter purple. So let's just go to there this time and call that good. And I can double click it, single click it rather, and now you can see that the purple is added to that part of the shirt as well. And if I start to zoom out, you can see what kind of effect that has. And you could do the same thing with any part of this image, changing the color of these objects to manipulate what this object looks like as a whole. So play around with this option as well, see what kind of effects you can get. When you're done editing, you can say File, Save As. My apologies. Rather than a Save As in Illustrator, we use File, Export. And the format that we'll use for this, we'll go ahead and use a PNG here. And I'm going to name it Illustrator so that we know this is the one that was created in Illustrator. I'll say Export and OK. And now, on our desktop, as soon as this is done, we should have all three of our altered images. Let's minimize that. So there's our black and white image that we created in Photoshop, our pink background image that we created in Photoshop, and our Illustrator vector-based image that we created in Photoshop with all of these specific, clearly defined shapes. Right? Now that we have our three photo manipulations here, we're ready to pull them into InDesign. So let me show you how you can go about doing that. I've laid out the frames for you in this document. If I select one of those frames and go to File, Place, this is for the original photo. So I'll select the original photo from my desktop right there. I'll say Open, and it placed that photo inside the frame. This photo is a lot higher resolution than the frame, so it's stretched outside. I need to resize this image to fit within the frame. To do that, I can just double click on the image, and now you see we have this brown outline. This is for the image itself rather than the frame. I'll hold down the Shift key and resize this down, and this is changing just the image, not the frame. So now you can see we've got it to fit within the frame. That looks good, and that's our original photo. You can go through and do the same thing with each of these. We'll place a photo in, and let's use the Illustrator one right here. Open. I will need to resize that as well, and might have to move this one around a little bit to make it work too. Hold down the Shift key whenever we make those changes so that we don't mess up the aspect ratio. And there you go, you can see the color manipulation that was done there. And you can go through and do the same thing for the last two. I think that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to help you. If you've got some other technique that you'd be interested in learning about, feel free to shoot those questions my way as well. I'm happy to help you there. And good luck with this exercise. I hope you guys have some fun. This is a bit more free, it's a bit more creatively freeing exercise, I think, than the past few. So I hope that you enjoy it and have fun with it. Good luck.